Thanks, Stephanie. And I just want to reiterate Bill's earlier comments. I think without Stephanie's leadership, we wouldn't have anything to talk about today. So thank you for that, Mr. Rahand. All right, I'm going to ask Mark, Jessica, Kim, and Bray to join me up here. I'm very excited about our next session. I think we often struggle about, do we have the patient group view before or after the sort of scientific discussion? So here we are in the afternoon. I think we have a great opportunity to hear some reactions to, so here's some reactions to the sessions earlier today. Clearly, Mark is taken aback by what these are.
Very excited to be here.
All right, so I also want to encourage folks to get involved in this dialogue. Stephanie had instructed us to, not have this just be a Q&A session, but really for folks in the audience to chime in with your thoughts and ask questions of the panel and for us to discuss amongst ourselves. But first, I'd like us all to maybe introduce yourselves and your organizations that you work for and the work that you do in the patient space, particularly in the intersection of medical product development and evaluation. Bray?
Okay. Hi, so I'm Bray Patrick Lake. I am the Director of Stakeholder Engagement at the Clinical Trials Transformation Initiative, and that's actually another FDA public-private partnership to improve the quality and efficiency of clinical trials. I'm tasked largely with patient engagement and research, and really certainly getting patients to the table in clinical trial design to improve clinical trials, but I also am personally a device patient, and I'm the president of the PFO Research Foundation, and I think our case in particular has been very heavily affected by leaving the patient voice out of benefit risk and clinical trial design. So I have a lot of personal interest in this matter, and I was certainly delighted to be part of developing the framework.
What about your other roles?
No, I left out, no. Really?
Yeah.
Okay, so I'm actively involved in the PCORNet. I work on patient engagement for PCORNet, which is our National Clinical Data Research Network. That we have a number of people here from, and then I'm also the co-chair for the Precision Medicine Initiative that is the president's latest and greatest thing that I'm really hoping will bring great advances in science to patients.
See, those are important roles. My name's Kim McCleary, and I'm Director of Strategic Initiatives at an organization called Faster Cures. We're a center of the Milken Institute, and we work across diseases and medical conditions and look for barriers in the system that add time and expense to the process of getting promising medical therapies from the bench to patients. And as Ross mentioned, that includes reimbursement at this point. And I lead a program that was initially focused on benefit risk assessment and doing that from a patient-centered perspective, and that we have now sort of expanded out to really bringing into play this whole science of patient input and how do we advance that. And Jeff started with that this morning because that sort of becomes the connective tissue between the discovery phase, the development phase, and the delivery phase out into the market and reimbursement. So pleased to be part of the steering committee and to celebrate the accomplishments from today.
So I'm the clumsy Mark Buden from the National Health Council.
Acrobatic.
Exactly. I almost did a backflip there. For those of you who are not aware, the National Health Council is an umbrella organization of patient advocacy organizations, groups that you would know like the American Cancer Society, American Heart, American Diabetes, as well as many other organizations. Our focus has always been about patients and providing a united voice for people with chronic disease and disabilities. We have all stakeholders in membership, but the governance is controlled by the CEOs of the patient organizations. And we focus in on two things, two systemic issues that are important to all people with chronic conditions. One is access to care, and the second is how do you make that care, those treatments better? And so we've found ourselves at the forefront of looking at those issues and really being heavily steeped in how do we develop metrics for patient engagement throughout the system. And I hope we'll get a chance to come back to that point in a few minutes.
Hi, everyone. I'm Jessica Foley. I'm the Chief Scientific Officer at the Focused Ultrasound Foundation. I'm very happy to be here today and a part of this panel. So you may not be familiar with our foundation or with Focused Ultrasound, but our foundation is a medical technology research, education, and advocacy organization, and we operate similar to a lot of disease-specific foundations. We fund research, we raise awareness, we work with patients a lot in trying to bring focused ultrasound, which is a medical device technology, to patients as quickly as possible, because it has a lot of potential to treat many different serious medical conditions, everything from uterine fibroids to different cancers to essential tremor and Parkinson's disease. And so we're really working in a lot of different areas to try to get this to patients faster. It's something that's available at a lot of sites throughout the world, but not as many patients here in the U.S. have access to it. And so we work with patients more in the reimbursement arena so far, but hoping to also bring their voices to the regulatory process for new applications of the technology.
Thank you. So I'm going to pry a little bit more into some of the work that you do, and then I think I'd like to hear reactions to the earlier sessions. But first, Bray, in your work at Citi, you've done a lot to integrate the patient voice into all of the decision points around clinical trials. Do you want to talk a little bit about that initiative and where you're going with that?
Sure. So a lot of you have probably seen we have a chevron graphic that really goes from preclinical all the way to post-market and looking at the various phases within clinical trial continuum where patients can have an impact. And so we've really worked to come up with some best practices. We know that there's work going on in various arenas and kind of siloed and fragmented, and we're really working across the spectrum to increase the effectiveness of engagement between patient groups and sponsors of research. And I think we should have some recommendations coming out from our project fairly shortly. If you go on the Citi website and look under the patient groups tab on our projects, we have an expert meeting summary from the meeting in January that really is the roadmap that goes, from A to Z as far as NCATS, and certainly Janet Woodcock did our opening comments and went, all of the regulatory opportunities to incorporate the patient voice. That work has really shown that it's more than just a hypothesis. We know that patients should be at the table. We do know that we together we all design better clinical trials, and that we should be collaborating, that there's no one partner that can get max benefit as far as designing a clinical trial when you leave a voice out. And so Bennett earlier said, you gave an example where somebody didn't know what the endpoint should be, and they worked with the patient community, and I listened to that, and to me, from the patient community, I'm like, duh, like a lot of this, Mark, I've heard you say driving the car backwards down the road, like we're going back and we're doing things that we should have been doing it, from the beginning of time. But again, there's that issue of how you do it in a legitimate way, and I think the framework and the patient preference work is it's quantifiable. It actually isn't just the qualitative piece. We're really taking that to the quantitative, and that's going to be very important. Bennett Levitan is working on another project with us where we're actually doing a value assessment at Citi, where we take all of the different activities across the clinical trial continuum, and we're really trying to look at the different drivers in a probabilistic kind of way of would this improve the probability of the success of a clinical trial if you use the patient voice in this way. And so that's really the next level of the work at Citi.
Thank you. Jessica, your organization, as you mentioned, plays a number of different roles. Can you speak for a moment about the research program in particular? And I'm interested in whether you think, so although your organization is oriented around a technology, you said it's structured and perhaps the culture is similar to many of the disease advocacy organizations. Do you think that it will require a mindset or culture shift for such organizations to think about doing research in preference-type studies?
Yeah, I think that a lot of the organizations that we work with, we do work with a lot of patient organizations, and they may be thinking about this already, but definitely the device manufacturers that in our field that we also work with, I don't think this is yet something that they've been thinking about. It brings to mind prostate cancer, which is an area that is hopefully nearing approval here in the U.S. for treatment with focused ultrasound, but I know that patient preference information could be very useful there because there are a lot of patients that leave the U.S. and have been traveling all over the world to get these treatments, and they have spoken to us about what they perceive as a lot of benefit for something that's non-invasive, that they can get back to work quickly and have a lower recovery time. But because it is a non-invasive sort of image-guided therapy versus something that is more standard of care, like a surgical procedure, there could be risk of, treating some areas that are nearby, that could lead to, some sort of minor complications that they might be willing to accept. And so I think that's one area where this could be useful. And I know we also have done work in speaking with patients with uterine fibroids. We surveyed 1,000 women with uterine fibroids and just talking to them about what are the worst symptoms that they experience, how do they feel about different treatment options, what's most important to them. Fertility is something that's important to them. They like the idea of non-invasive procedures as well, and that's something that we're using more in the reimbursement efforts because there are challenges there. So I think that we have a lot of opportunity now, and this framework will really give us more of a guidance for how we can perform some more studies, probably in collaboration with patient groups.
That's great. Yeah, and when you were talking about the kinds of patient input you've elicited thus far, I was reminded of what I think is the intentional structure of the patient-focused drug development meetings to kind of elicit that kind of input from patient groups. And so, as you said, transitioning into another facet of patient input, I think will be really is a great opportunity that's afforded by this framework being in place. Kim, you're also wear many hats, and I don't know that you mentioned your role on the PCORI patient engagement panel. The patient-centric movement is certainly not limited to regulatory context. Do you want to speak a little bit about the work that group is doing and how it's incorporating the patient input into research?
Sure. So PCORI, and Brian Luce is here. He can speak to the mission, and many of you are probably familiar with the Patient-Centered Outcomes Research Institute that really has as its core mandate to find ways or to make sure that patients are included at every step along the way of the research that it supports and funds and fosters in the broader community. And Mark sits on the Patient Engagement Advisory Panel with me. We spend a lot of time side by side at meetings. The four of us actually do. But what PCORI did early on, and this maybe Mark was really integrally involved with this, was coming up with an engagement rubric, looking at all the steps of the research process, from priority setting to defining what the questions were, and how patients could be and should be involved with that process, and what PCORI should be looking for from its applicants to demonstrate that was meaningful engagement, that it wasn't just tokenism, it wasn't some academic sitting in his or her office at 11:50 p.m. when the application is due at midnight saying, hey, can I put your name on this document and we'll talk later about what that means. They were really looking to do research differently, and that's the tagline of the whole institute, is research done differently. So I think that process of trying to define what does patient engagement look like as we move along the continuum, and as we as funders at PCORI start to prioritize patient engagement as one of the elements in our research portfolio, how does that translate over to NIH, over to academic institutions, even to patient organizations that fund research? We have a TRAIN network, the Research Acceleration and Innovation Network, and we've recently gone through an application process to add new patient philanthropies to that group, and it was really fascinating to ask them to demonstrate that they were patient-centered, and quite frankly, some of them couldn't meet the standard that we had set as a minimum expectation. So I think there's this cultural shift, and it's sort of accepted that patient organizations are patient-centered, but I think some of them still, need to rethink some of their own practices and priorities, and PCORI's work really, I think, has gotten that ball moving.
Great, thank you. I do want to get your reactions next to the previous sessions that you heard, but I thought it was important for people in the room and also the many FDA reviewers and members of industry and others who are listening in on the webinar to kind of get a bigger picture of what's going on and the incredible amount of energy and enthusiasm in the patient community to get a seat at the table and find ways to meaningfully integrate their input and their voices into all of the decision-making points along the total product life cycle. Whoever wants to go first, can you hear some reactions to the previous sessions on the work that MDIC has done in the framework and catalog and how that work, as well as FDA's statement of encouraging these types of studies to come in will be that you think how patient groups will react to that and how this will help patient groups engage and, Mark, to your point, know how to incorporate that input?
Sure. So I want to respond in a way by telling you a little bit of a story, and that is that I grew up in northern Maine in a place where most people didn't have electricity or running water. In fact, we used to haul the water in from the lake. And I was desperate to leave, as you can imagine. My ticket out was at 13. I won an essay contest, which put me in Europe. And so I lived in Europe. I went to school. Actually, I have a British law degree. And I worked there for a while and had really envisioned living in Europe at that point. I'd been there for about 15 years. The reason I came back to the United States was everyone in my family was diagnosed with one or more chronic conditions, almost at the same time. It was a span of about 3 months. Almost all of them died about the same time, just a couple of years apart. I came home and settled in Boston and actually started practicing civil rights law there. And the reason I did that was to be close to where my family was, so I could help take care of them. And I experienced firsthand, and eventually became a patient myself, the challenges of receiving care that actually met my needs, and how you had to fight the system to try and get what you wanted to help you support and live your life, which is a real challenge because for people with chronic conditions, and the system is again geared towards people with acute care, are going to live their lives with their condition until they die. Very few chronic conditions are cured. And so the system was not geared towards that. And I was actually loaned to a nonprofit for a year from my firm, and that's what put me into patient advocacy. And I moved to D.C. about 11 years ago and became much more engaged in how do we develop treatments. So I've always had a hand in how do we deal with patient engagement in the delivery of care and shared decision-making techniques and things along those lines, which I thought were terrific, but they seem to get blunted by the system. And so we being the patient community, really turned our focus back to the development of new treatments. And it's sort of reminiscent of what happened with the HIV/AIDS community, where we demanded a seat at the table, we got it, and then we organized ways for engagement, but the way that eventually evolved took the patient engagement really out of the system from my perspective. And so we've all been engaged in trying to figure out how to make that better. And I'll tell you, there are several sort of seminal points that I think are critical. One was in PDUFA 4, when we decided that patients would engage the FDA in the drug development process. That was a change in how that agreement would be created. And it ultimately led to elements that became the patient-focused drug development program, which was another seminal moment. Patient community was integral in creating PCORI. And in fact, we got over 20 provisions about patient engagement into the legislation that created PCORI, and then have been partnering with PCORI on the implementation of that. This is another seminal point. With the catalog, with the framework, with the guidance coming out of FDA, these are points we're going to look back on and reflect about how they change the environment and culture. I think our next step is how we take this back to the delivery system. All that we're learning about patient engagement in drug development, in device development, in research, now has to be reapplied to how we develop quality measures, how we develop delivery systems, and how we develop the financing mechanisms. Because the worst thing that could possibly happen from my perspective right now is that all this great work is going to lead to great treatments that identify different preferences that would be of great value to individual patients, but we may never get access to them, or we may never get access to the information that helps us to make the decision for the right product to get to us. I think there's a huge opportunity moving forward to align the system so that patients get access to the treatment that meets their specific preferences. That is something we've never really been able to achieve, and there's a huge opportunity. The last thing I would say about that is, and I often make this joke myself, we in the patient community want access to everything that is made. We want you all to make it better, and we don't want to pay for it. And there's sort of this added joke when people talk about patients, they say, well, those patients, they want everything. Well, collectively, patients do want everything. And collectively, we throw everything at them. The waste in the system is huge, and a lot of patients are getting care that they don't actually want. And in fact, they go doctor to doctor shopping for the right care. Patients don't want everything. Patients want the care that actually addresses their needs. And that refers to not only their goals and aspirations, but all the social determinants of health that affect what they can and cannot do. And in order for us to get there, we have to have treatments that have preference-sensitive data around it. We need to communicate it, and we need a system that allows access to that. So a lot of changes to come, but this is the catalyst for change not only in device, diagnostic, but drugs, but also in how we construct quality measures, deliver care, and finance it.
Can I build on Mark's history that I think is so important, and Stephanie brought it up too, just this changing role of what it means to be a patient. And if you look back historically, and Jeff started with this sort of paternalistic system that imposed its preferences on the patient, and the patient was the passive recipient of care. And then we sort of moved in the early 1900s to the patients being the patrons for research. And maybe one of the first notable examples was 1938, when the March of Dimes was created by President Roosevelt to try to expand research on polio. And the March of Dimes, mobilized literally people in the streets collecting dimes for research, and led to first the iron lung, the creation of the iron lung, and then successful vaccines. So mobilizing patients as patrons in research changed the face of the polio epidemic. And then, we go through the 1900s, and we had this period of social unrest when the trust in institutions in the 1960s was really falling, and you've got Vietnam and Watergate, and there were movements in the patient community as well, and the sort of claim of nothing about us without us was a big movement within the disability community. And in 1973, the American Hospital Association adopts the Patient's Bill of Rights, which is unbelievable to me that it took that long for patients to expect that they would know their diagnosis. I mean, how basic is that? So if you start with 1973 and that expectation that I, as an individual, will know my diagnosis and my doctor will tell me what my prescription is and I'll have some voice, even small, in those decisions, we've come kind of a long way. And I think today will be another one of those milestones, as Mark really eloquently spoke to, this idea of really precision medicine in action, and what do we know about the therapies that are being developed and how they might integrate with someone's preferences and values, and feed into the decision-making that you would do jointly with your care provider and with your family and the others around you that are affected by your health. I think it's really a seminal accomplishment to have this tool set and this guidance from the agency that will inform industry about what it should be doing and ways for patient communities to tap into their own patient base and to become more empowered start shaping the environment for the care that's available. And as Mark said, we've got some work to do to make sure it's accessible, but at least if those technologies and other therapies can start to advance through the system, hopefully we can all continue working together to make sure that there's access to those therapies.
So I wanted to pick up just on the piece of what a great data is for regulatory science. I think this is an important day for patients. We've been hearing over the last few years patient centricity, patient empowerment, patient engagement, need for increasing patient voice, and I'm glad that we've culturally kind of shifted the mindset, but then there's still the issue of what do you do with it? So some of our work at City, which is the best practices for effective engagement with patient groups, has been certainly important, but even, feeling like I've seen a huge shift in the FDA as far as welcoming patient voice, but when you need to put something into a marketing application and into a regulatory decision, you have to have a certain level of science and framework, and it's not just enough to have patients at a meeting who say, I want access to this device. And so I'm very excited that this work has actually exceeded my expectations on what the deliverable was and the usefulness of it. We've had a desperate gap, not just in devices, but in drug development as well, the different methods and what type of study do you use and what kind of methods can you use to elicit the patient voice in a scientifically meaningful way. I've served as a patient rep on circulatory systems devices and cardiovascular and renal drugs, and as much as other members, I think it's painful. The patients come up with this really gripping, emotional story, and you hear, what they're really saying is, I have unmet need, and there's a huge burden of this with this therapy, and so we're talking about things that we can frame in a sciencey way that the patients don't know, but yet usually those people leave and then we go back and have our scientific discussion about whatever the level of evidence is. And it was a great story and it was sad, but we still don't know what to do with it. So I'm just very excited that we're finally going to be having a way to kind of quantify the patient voice. And I'm also really excited that I think this was a win. I work at a public-private partnership, and to have a startup and to come in and to actually have a project and to meet your timeline and come up with, a credible deliverable. You guys, FDA and all the folks that worked on this, thank you, because it is a big day and a big win for this group. And then I think there's also something a little satisfying for me being a device patient that to see the implementation and the uptake in pharma going, hey, look, this is what happened in the device community and we want to use this framework, I think is also very exciting. And then personally, my patient group, we have been very stuck. We were part of a trial that had a superiority design, and I feel like we do want to be bringing new products on, and we want to get better and better with each product we introduce into the market. But at the same time, my patient group had a very strong patient preference that was completely left out of the trial design process, and in the end, the trial missed its primary endpoint. Had it been a non-inferiority study, it all probably would have come out in the wash, but we have patients with strong preferences, and now there's no product coming to market, and we still have patients that I hear from every day with unmet needs, so I'm excited that we might be able to, remedy some of those situations going forward.
Just to add a little bit, I think as was mentioned before, medical devices, it's a very unique challenge in terms of trying to regulate medical devices because there are so many different types, there are so many different ways that patients might interact with them, different types of procedures they might undergo, and I think that it's great to have this type of a framework that really does allow, really is very rigorous and scientific, and hopefully it will be an example that then other sort of aspects, people that are involved in patient access, like the payers, like the medical institutions, like the doctors. I think today we've touched on the medical institutions and the payers, but maybe not the providers. And I think that particularly with medical devices, providers have a big role to play in terms of what are they comfortable, which devices are they comfortable using, what are they going to talk to their patients about. And so it's important to have patient groups involved to inform their patients, but it's also important to get the buy-in from the providers, and from the institutions to make this technology actually available to patients. Also, different parts of the country, people will have different levels of access, and that's something to keep in mind as well with medical devices versus, say, drugs, where you could have you could have drugs available in rural communities, but maybe the medical devices aren't going to be available there. So I think this is a great first start or jumping off point, and then I think there's a lot of other things that we need to look at to really ensure that patients have full access to great therapies.
Thank you. Okay, we've got this framework in place, there's momentum, all the stakeholders have skin in the game. Mark, as you said, the next step is how do we actually implement this, right? How do we move forward to a place where this is part of how we actually routinely think about the context within which we're making decisions. So let's unpack this a little. What advice would you have for patient groups who would be interested in getting these studies done, or other ways of getting their input integrated into our decision-making process? Is there a place to start?
So I think there are a couple of interesting opportunities, and Kim actually put her finger on something that is concerning to me, and that is that we in the patient advocacy community have been around in this country for over 300 years. And one of the things I like to say is that when we began, our email was being delivered via Pony Express. And it's important to recognize that our business model was fundamentally created over 300 years ago. Our business model has largely not changed in 300 years. In the last several years, you're seeing our business model shift dramatically. And I think that's a good thing. But the challenge has been for 300 years, because patient engagement was really not considered that important, we were the voice of patients. And we historically have been the best place to get a broad perspective of what multiple people with a condition would think about certain issues. And there's still some truth to that, because we represent people across the spectrum of disease, from before they have the disease, with prevention, all the way to death, and the perspectives can shift along that continuum. But to Kim's point, most of us have not started to engage with these new methods of engagement. And I think it's a huge opportunity for us, and here's why. And I think this was alluded to in one of the earlier panels, and Teresa, I think you've sort of spurred it with your question, and that is, are companies going to do this themselves? Are they going to send it out to third-party vendors? Is it going to go to marketers? And how is it going to be perceived and valued, especially when this sector has always been viewed with some level of mistrust? I think our sector has a huge opportunity to be an intermediary in this space, to provide credibility to how this work is conducted, to also help frame those starting questions. I worked with a number of folks in the biopharmaceutical device industry that said, well, we're going to go to our marketers. They know how to do this. Well, yeah, they know how to do it, but they look at it through the lens of how you distribute a product or a service. That's a different perspective than it is to start with what is important to the patient and how you engage them. So there's actually a huge role for us to partner with all of you in how this gets done for the biopharmaceutical device sector. And then to the point that was also made earlier, when it comes to area where innovation has stopped or slowed, there's a really huge opportunity for us to catalyze change by identifying what are the meaningful opportunities. Huge opportunities there.
Right. So I think we've, in the patient community, spent a lot of time talking about the evolution of patient engagement, which you've just heard a bit about, and what the new areas are and the new models and methods that groups are using. And I think we're definitely in a day and age of being really smart about what you do on behalf of your patient community and with their resources, because you have finite resources. And so we're really in shifting to milestone-driven research, and then also leveraging our patient group assets to de-risk medical product development is something that is a tactic, that's being used. And in this case, so if patients are putting together biobanks and registries and doing natural history studies, I think the benefit risk assessment, like Parent Project Muscular Dystrophy, that is a tool that you unpack and you say, I'm ready to engage in this partnership around product development or clinical trial design, and this is what our patient community has done to actually get ready to do that. I think it's going to be interesting. So if a sponsor kind of is the gatekeeper and holds the keys to bringing that into a marketing application, I am going to be very interested to see what happens, if a patient group with a patient voice in a quantifiable way is kind of left out of that, what the other opportunities are going to be. So I'd be interested to see how that develops in the future.
Kim, go ahead.
So I've got three sort of action items for my colleagues in the patient community. And the first is, to prioritize data. Data is going to be the new currency. There will always be room for the compelling stories, the personal testimony about the real-world impacts of disease on our lives, but data is going to be where it's at, and the products from today are only going to drive that train faster. And the data needs to support the breadth of experience within a patient community. I'm going to steal a phrase that Bray often uses, that we're sort of, and Mark spoke to this too, in a patient-centered environment right now, where we've got a few patients that are sort of the poster voices for their community. And what we really need to do is now widen the net and understand that things happen along the continuum. We've talked all day about the heterogeneity within patient communities, and we in the patient community need to accept that fact as well, that we don't speak with one voice. And I often say there is no single patient voice. It's just silly to make that a singular noun. We've got to build the data sets, whether that's through registries or research platforms online, to really reflect that. The second one is to expand out beyond the connected community that might exist within your organization now. Many organizations think of engagement for fundraising or bringing walks or fundraising events, awareness events, advocacy, hill days. But we've really got to go beyond the people that would sort of self-select and do really vigorous outreach to make sure that when we're speaking about the patient experience, we're taking the whole range of things into account. And the third point really builds on that, and that's to think about patient communities being somewhere beyond just the borders of a clinic or somebody who's going to come to a fundraising event or a documentary premiere. We've got to start thinking about, people in the faith-based communities who might be gathering at the YMCA, or I heard in one device specific to the obesity clinic that they went out to Weight Watchers because they knew those patients were already gathered in those places. We're going to have to think beyond normal boxes that we used to be very comfortable with about who is our community, where do we find them, and how do we engage them and equip them to be real partners in this effort, whether it's through precision medicine, whether it's through patient preference studies, whether it's to just be partners to contribute their data and to sign the consent form to say, yes, I want you to know what my Fitbit says about what I did today. All of that is going to be really important data that will really help inform and move this forward. Bill?
Yeah, I think Jessica brought it up in terms of the importance of the provider. As disruptive technologies come forward, oftentimes patients are within a channel of the healthcare system that biases them or predisposes them towards a certain procedural approach, depending on the provider that they're working with or the society. How do you think the work here is going to influence this, and how does the message to the patients of the full spectrum of options that they may have available, how do they become aware of that? Any thoughts there from the panel?
Well, I do think that because the framework is laying out very scientifically rigorous ways of doing things, or of collecting this patient information, that's very important. I would think that reaching the provider community through their specialty societies and things where they're really going to want that hardcore evidence, and so publications and things would probably be a good way to start reaching them. I know one thing that we find as well is that we talk to a lot of different patient organizations that are related to specific diseases, but they may not even be looking outside of maybe the normal treatment options that they've thought about, drugs that could potentially cure their diseases. So I think that also when it comes to medical device therapies in particular, there's going to be an added challenge even with the patient organization. So, companies perhaps need, if they're not already talking with patient organizations because of the things we're talking about now, just in terms of educating them on this technology, because that's also another area that could make it hard to reach patients about things like this.
Let me lay out a sort of a 5-year strategy that I think is critical, and I know you've heard part of this, so I apologize, but we have to address quality measures, financing, and delivery system reform so that at the center of care is an opportunity for people to understand what's important to that patient and align care with that. And if anyone in the delivery system thinks we're already doing a good job of that, I'd love to talk to you. But I can tell you from my perspective and the perspective of the organizations I represent, we're not. And I call this the Patient Trifecta. And so let me ask, does anybody in the room play horses? Anyone do the horses? Anyone willing to admit it? I know some of you do. I'll tell you what a trifecta is in horse racing. It means you guess the top 3 horses in the right order. And if you get them right, you win big. From a patient perspective in the delivery of care, there's a trifecta. You need the science to be there to give you whatever clinical care you need. But the other 2 parts of the trifecta are the journey you take towards that scientific opportunity. And that includes those social determinants of health, geography, your social economic status, religion, culture. All those things are important to what you're willing, able to do. And I'll just give you a quick example. I have a relative in northern Maine, single mom, works part-time, has a child with autism, has her mom with Alzheimer's, all living with her. She's 8 hours away from the nearest academic medical center. She has low health literacy, low socioeconomic status, low opportunity to seek help, and yet all of those things have huge implications on what she's able to do for the care for her family. Who's developing the treatments that help her manage her life? If you start to get into patient preference data, you start looking at those issues, and you start to identify treatments that meet your life circumstances. Huge opportunity. That's the second part of the trifecta. The third part is why do people live? And we don't just live for the sake of living. And we look at patients, especially people with complex chronic conditions, as the folks that, well, they just want to be healthy. Well, yeah, they'd like to be healthy, but I can tell you they all have goals. They all have milestones that they're trying to achieve. They want to see a grandchild go to graduate school. They want to walk a daughter down the aisle. They want to be able to play golf in retirement. We all have goals and aspirations. The system never asks us. Those goals and aspirations and that journey you're capable of taking have huge implications for what treatment meets your preference. And the patient community is beginning to organize to try and compel the delivery system to shift by changing the quality measures, by changing the delivery system financing. Imagine if there was a quality measure that's just a process measure that said for that 20% of the population that drives 80 to 90% of the cost in the system, that you had to figure out with that patient and the family caregiver, what are those goals and aspirations that that patient has? And then a second process measure, how did you align a care plan that helps that patient to achieve those goals given the journey that they're able to take? And then you finance it so that a provider could spend 90 minutes with that person rather than 2 minutes. And then you allowed the quality measures to drive that sort of interaction and remove the quality measures that go against it. One of the members of my family that died had lung cancer. And the quality measures around lung cancer are get the patient to stop smoking. Every time that person went into the medical system, they hounded him to quit smoking. They hounded his wife to get him to quit smoking. And they drove him nuts for the 9 months he had left to live. That doesn't make sense. We can realign the system, and that's where the patient community is going next. That will create an opportunity for these products that address preference-sensitive needs to come into the market where you have a system that is looking at what are the goals, what are the journey that you can take, and then aligning those treatments to it. It's a very new model, but it's a really exciting opportunity that should come together in time for these products to come to market.
Thank you. I think we have time for one last question right up here.
Are you sure?
Yeah.
Barry Lytle with Edwards Life Sciences. Earlier today, there were a couple of references to what would happen if one of these analyses were done, tool was used, and it came out that, let's say, only 10% of the patient population would have been willing to take the risk for the benefit that the device is providing. And I think that there were some assumptions that either FDA should approve it or shouldn't approve it. From the patient's perspective, what do you guys think? Let's say a device gets only 10% of the patient population thinks it's worth it and be willing to use the device. 90% of the population wouldn't even try it.
So I'll take that, yeah. So I think there's a real opportunity here because we know that there's no one-size-fits-all patient. And this is a real-world case. It's going to happen sooner than later. So really we want to get down to ascertaining who is that subgroup and then making sure they're informed of their risks and benefits. And I'm really interested in maybe some type of tools for assuring safe use, something that takes it, you need to engage in the provider conversation, but also that it comes with the product. So if the provider tries to sidestep that and not make sure that there's a fully informed patient, there's some type of, mechanism that's a safeguard. But I do think we need to really think of, particularly as we're going towards precision medicine and realizing that we're all individuals and that it's not just the phenotype, the genotype, the metabolomics, the gut microbiome, and all of the environmental things that come into that. Those numbers are going to get smaller. There's not going to be a 95% of anybody. We're going to have different subgroups. And I think that we have an opportunity to create, through this framework, and eliciting patients' risks and benefits and understanding thereof, and then accompanying tools to solve some of those challenges and hopefully gain approval, at least for that subgroup.